Hello and welcome to BadgerPod Nerdcast number 26 or 27. His was the most human. I'm your host, Brian Martinez, and I have a great group of panelists. We're going to discuss Star Trek. I think that this is such an enormous topic, and this could go in any number of chaotic directions. So I'm really interested to see what we talk about. And those of you in the chat, if you have any questions, feel free to chime in with any comments or questions. We like to read them. So first I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Brian Martinez.
Hello, and welcome to
And sorry about that. I run the Nerdcast and the Gamergate show. I also have a webcomic. It's goodguycomics.com, and it is managed flawlessly by my compatriot Mad Cat, who is on the show today. Mad Cat, would you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Hi, this is Chris Vody, but you're free to call me Mad Cat. I am a writer. You can find my books on Amazon and Goodreads. As Brian mentioned, I am the site admin for Good Guy Comic and also the forums as well, where everyone can join to discuss men issues. I also have a YouTube channel under the name Mad Cat where I do videos under Angry Egalitarian.
All right, thank you for that. We also have Allison Tiemann. Allison, hi.
Hello. I guess, well, not I guess, but Honey Badger Radio is my brainchild. I do a sci-fi web comic called Xenospora, which you can find at www.xenospora.com. It's sort of an adult take on the issues that we discuss in this particular venue, but in a dramatic format rather than, I don't know what, media criticism? Is that what we do? Media criticism? Anyway, throwing it back to Brian.
Yeah, I guess what we do is more like just talking, and that's more like a narrative. So yeah. We also have Mr. Mike, Dr. Random Cam. If you don't, please.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Dr. Random Cam. You can find me on YouTube. Being that name, I'm a slightly sadistic satirist. I do jokes at people. Some of those people can take those jokes, and some of those people can't. The more people who can take it, the more entertaining it is. And the fewer people who can take it, the more educational it is.
Indeed. That was awesome. Then we have Anna Cherry Pie.
Hello. I am a cosplayer and adult entertainer, aka porn star, and I also write on men's issues, anti-feminist issues, and sexual liberation type content on slutty-girl-problems.com occasionally, and mainly on my Medium, which is medium.com/@Anna_Cherry. I also have a YouTube channel, goes by Anna Cherry on top, where I've launched a series called Tropes versus Men, as well as other vlogs and shenanigans. And I am a massive Trekkie, huge, wide, gigantic, big, everything Trekkie. And as I was saying on Popular Opinion Time, I'm not a huge fan of Star Wars in that sense, so like a little bit of rivalry. Star Wars, Star Trek, I pick the Star Trek side any day, all day. So that's how much of a Trekkie I am. Over and out. Beam me up, Scotty. I'm done.
Oh. And lastly, we have Nephenor.
Greetings, humans. I am the alien known as Nephenor. I've come to your planet to make 3D renderings of naughty things. I also rant about things on YouTube and yell at people on Twitter for fun.
Yes, post dank memes, sir.
Dank memes.
So we're going to get right into the Star Trek conversation, and Nephenor has supplied us with a handy little thing to get the discussion going. Mr. Nephenor, would you mind?
Alrighty. Once again, feminism has jumped the shark. Before his body has even been laid to rest, and while many of us are still mourning his passing, the bigots at the Huffington Post have taken their flag with the upraised fist and rammed it into the corpse of Leonard Nimoy, claiming him as their own. That's right, Artie Patel, in a fit of supreme arrogance and blind bigotry, has claimed the famed actor, best known for his portrayal of Mr. Spock for countless years, as a feminist. And just what gives him the right to claim a dead man who never said a single positive thing about them, but was criticized during his life by them? Equality, of course. In a sad and pathetic attempt to make feminism more about equality than the truth of what it actually does to ruin lives, they are claiming that anyone who fights for equality while alive is one of theirs once they are dead and cannot argue with them. And just what are their claims based on? Well, let's see. He fought for pay disparity between various cast members, some of whom were not getting paid the same. Of course, since one of them was Nichelle Nichols, that must mean he was a feminist, despite the fact that he also fought for George Takei. And that wasn't the only instance. He also stood up for his fellow cast members when he wanted them to do the voices for the animated series and refused to sign on until they were signed up. It couldn't be the fact that he was showing respect for his fellow actors and wanting them all to share in the acclaim of the show. Nope, it had to be that he was a feminist. What is even more nuts is they are claiming because he helped a mixed-race teen who is having troubles finding friends, that is somehow also showing he was a feminist. Doesn't matter that the teen was not having problems because she was a girl. Nope, it's all feminism. But the most ludicrous part is that he received backlash from feminists in the 80s because of his directorial work on 3 Men and a Baby. That's right, a movie which portrayed good fathers and caring men received backlash from feminists. Go figure! Now they are saying that is a part of feminism because the movie challenged gender roles. Too bad that it also challenged the feminist narrative both then and now that men are terrible demons who should never be allowed custody. Too bad it challenges the current work of the National Organization for Women who are trying to fight default shared parenting. And to top it off, they say because he did charity work with his wife, that must mean he was a feminist. After all, no one has done charitable work outside of feminism. In the end, this is just the dying gasp of feminism in its desperation. It has been seen in recent years shaming everyone who doesn't identify with them, and now they are trying to claim every decent human being who dies to be one of their own. Why? Because fewer and fewer people actually believe their lies anymore, and the rest of us are getting sick of it. Feminism has tried to make the future theirs, but in this case, they will never make it there, because they will never boldly go anywhere, let alone somewhere a man hasn't gone before. They want him to go first, just in case it's dangerous, so they can timidly follow and claim the good things as their own. And to feminism, I say this. Hands off, this Vulcan ain't yours.
Okay, yeah. I wanted to point out one thing from that, and this is inspired by that particular article that shall go unnamed, but they said he was a feminist also because, including putting women in the forefront. So by having preferential treatment for women, they're saying, or by evincing preferential treatment for women, this is the basis that feminists are saying that Leonard Nimoy was a feminist, even though I don't think he would have called himself that, and nobody at the time really did. Okay, so essentially because he treated, or he had particular special treatment for women, he's a feminist. Then doesn't that sort of give lie to this whole equality thing? Or is that what patriarchy theory is for? Even though you want women to be treated better than men because of patriarchy, it's justified because that's equality. Anyway, I'll throw this out to Anna because I know she wanted to talk, so go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I have a few points. So it's interesting that they are doing grave standing on absolutely anyone that they choose to, as long as they're male, of course. So apparently when Elliot, so you're saying he was helping George Takei and others, and for equal pay and things like that. So here we have Elliot Rodgers, who actually stabbed 3 Asian men first. I don't know if people know this. He actually killed more men than women, but then of course they label him as an MRA. So it seems they can just flip that switch and tap dance on graves of and basically on tragedies, and spin them any way they want because they're moral like that. Anyway, but yeah, I love the Star Trek, the original one, which I started in my Star Trek exposure with TNG first, and then I moved on to the original Star Trek, and that actually kind of gave it an interesting I guess, juxtaposition, but I can't. Don't make me decide who do I like more, Picard or Kirk. That's one of those nerd questions. You know, I can tell you what the square root of gigantic number is, but don't ask me which one of those two I like better, because yeah. Anyway,
So,
but
Anna,
yes.
I'm sorry. I have a question for you.
Sure.
So who do you like more, Kirk or Picard?
Okay, well, I'm going to cosplay Rule 63 Kirk, so that might tell you a little something. But I'm actually hoping to do one of those, the classic, not the new movie. I actually had resisted watching the new movie until like the last moment, because it's like, it's nothing but explosions. There's none of the philosophy of it. I'm not going to watch this tripe, but then I watched it and liked it. But it was still explosions and tripe, but you know, they did a really good job of recasting all the characters, I think. And one more unpopular opinion, I can't stand the fucking Russian guy in Star Trek. Oh my god. Like, no, the Star Trek movie, they did a great job with their actor who actually is Russian. Thank you. He did a great, fantastic, amazing job in the new movie. But the original Star Trek, I can't, that guy, man, I just...
Do you mean Chekhov?
Oh, just don't say that name in my presence. Do not utter that name. The accent is so fake. Everything about the racial prejudices against the Caucasus, I just can't even. It's very strange to see that character portrayed as a Russian. And he's annoying as shit on top of that. He's like what they try to make Claptrap in Borderlands, like this annoying sidekick that just won't shut up. Anyway, no, I have personal prejudice against that guy. I'm sure if other people like him, great. But my ultimate favorite character would be Data. That's just... but he's basically Spock 2.0. So anyway, back to the point. I would like to cosplay Kirk, Rule 63 for a set on Cosplay Deviants, and there actually is a female Rule 63, basically, female Spock on there as well. A set that recently came out. Super adorable, sexy. You don't know you want to see it until you see it. It's great. So that brings me back to the original point of the 70s show that is Star Trek, the original one. They treated women in a fascinating way, where kind of reminds me of Russia as well, and this attitude that women are like feminine, right? And so you would like, you know, they would manhandle Uhura, like pick her up and like move her places, like she's this like figurine of like, but they also treated them with amazing respect in another way. So it's like this interesting balance of treating them as equals, but also as women, as feminine women, and those little outfits are just to die for. I love the short little dresses. And to cap it all off, I guess I'll go with in Russia we have a joke that goes, you let a woman go in first, you know, like chivalry, right? You let her go in first, you know, into the cave because maybe there's a bear. So, you know, he'll eat her first. So that's kind of a reverse of what you were saying about in your read-up. So I guess that's all I have. Not much of a point other than Star Trek is awesome. And yeah.
Okay, so I guess that makes it my turn. What's the square root of pi? No, don't answer that. So there's a couple of things, because I wrote an article on my other blog about what Leonard Nimoy meant to me, and the one thing about me is I can actually say that I've been watching Star Trek since I was born, because when my mother held me in her arms for the first time, she was watching Star Trek because she was a big fan of the original show. So I've been a very big Star Trek fan, and I've watched the movies on VHS so many times. And, you know, Leonard Nimoy was very important. Spock was a very, very important character to me. So any chance that I could find out information about the character or the actor portraying the character, I did. And one story I remember that I heard once, and I don't know if it's 100% true, but on the set for Star Trek VI, Kim Cattrall played a female Vulcan on there. And there's a rumor that Kim Cattrall apparently took a nude photo of herself while wearing the Vulcan ears. And everyone thought it was very nice, but Leonard Nimoy found the picture, took it, and ripped it up, and he was appalled by it because he thought it ruined what it meant to be a Vulcan. You know, he was really passionate about his character. And that's not really to say one way or the other that he was a feminist or not, but I would think that if someone was a feminist, they would more embrace that than what the character actually was. There's another thing to look at is, you know, saying what Nimoy did for Nichelle and George in the original Star Trek, saying, oh, well, this is evidence of feminism. Well, you could easily turn it around and say that it's about LGBT because George Takei was gay. Even back then, he was gay. Or you could even say that it was about racism because both of them were minorities. So you could spin this around any way you want to get that. But the beautiful thing about Leonard Nimoy as a director for not just 3 Men and a Baby, but for also Star Trek 3 and Star Trek 4, is that he did try to put a balance of the characters. Now, not so much in 3 Men and a Baby, but in the Star Trek films, he really did try to give male and female characters a good amount of time on screen and chances to shine. Like the scene where Uhura basically puts a young cadet into the closet. So to say that he was feminist, I think, is kind of an insult, and if anything, he was more egalitarian, but he did really care about men and women equally. But in 3 Men and a Baby, he really showed that men want to be parents, that they want to be responsible. They may not know how to do it instantly, but no one does. And there was even some suggestion in the movie that they expected women to know, and they're like, I don't know what to do with this. This is your problem. So I think he was very good at being an egalitarian, and to say otherwise is an insult to a great man.
All right. Well, I got a question about Star Trek. Well, what do you guys think about the relationship between I'm going to just go right into it because I think the 3 central characters of the original show were Bones, Spock, and Kirk. And they were like...
And Scotty. Can't forget Scotty.
Well, no.
Scotty!
I'm not trying to leave anybody out. I'm just trying to, like, this is the trifecta, right? Like, whenever they need to go to the...
Yeah, but the landing party would probably be 4 of them. And the red shirt.
It was sometimes 3 of them. If it was just like something simple or no one was going to die, it would be the 3 of them.
Yeah,
but
and
when
then they
shit
would
got
have a
real,
red
you
shirt.
needed Scotty, goddammit.
Well, okay, so, like, the character, the dynamics between the 3 that I'm mentioning, if we like, just keep
Right,
it...
you're talking about the triangle of tension, like, between
Essentially,
Bill,
yes.
Spock,
That's sort of
Kirk at the head of it
between
all.
Spock, yeah, between
It-
Spock
I
and
would
Kirk.
like to
Stops at
tackle
Scotty,
that
'cause-
one first,
Well-
if possible.
Just like it stops at Geordie, it stops at Scotty. It's got to stop at the techie guy. He's got to be the 4th,
I think they tried to fix that in Enterprise a little bit, because Trip was, like, a big deal. He's a progenitor for Scooter in Borderlands, by the way, totally. But anyway.
Okay, I'm gonna put out something that might be a little controversial to Trek fans. I actually think the Next Generation got away from the formula of the original series, in that in the original series, they used the character interaction and the character development to really ground the fantastical worlds that they were exploring. And I think that instead of using that human scale, the Next Generation ended up using these little technical details to fill out the world, and I found it fell flat for me. So I would say that I actually prefer the original series because... Go ahead.
A counter argument to that is that both the original Star Trek and Next Generation was spearheaded by Gene Roddenberry. And in a lot of ways of what we see in TNG is what he initially wanted for the original Trek, which was almost impossible to get. For instance, he initially wanted that the crew would take down a shuttlecraft on every single episode. But he decided against that because it would have been too costly, so they just made up the transporter as a plot convenience. So often what we see between the two is this is what he wanted to do for the original and couldn't.
Yeah, but still, I mean, they lost that element of even if you are allowed to have more of the technical qualities of the world, in a lot of ways, when you lose that element of character, you lose the veracity of the world, because character is how we get into these worlds and we feel the reality of them. And I dare anybody in the panel to clarify with Scott, with McCoy, Spock, and Kirk. You had a feeling of how they would react to something, and how they would react to each other. You had a sense of their personal interactions, which really is like, it was a way of establishing the world that they were within, their reactions to it. Now, I challenge anyone to really see that kind of a strong character and character interaction in the Next Generation, because I mean, most people know how McCoy would react to something, how Spock would react to it, how Kirk would react to it, and how each one of them would react to the other's reactions. I mean, there's a solidness there, a solidness of character that I just don't see in the Next Generation.
There's really only two solidly different characters in Next Gen, and that's Data and Worf. You can imagine how Data would react to things, and you can imagine how Worf would react to things. Everyone else, I said this the other day, everyone else on the Next Gen is pretty much a Mary Sue. Well, and even Data's a Mary Sue. everyone except Worf is pretty much, interchangeable in terms of which character would you use to interact with this idea we've got, with this species we've come up with. Which character would have the personality that, gets the best out of it? And they're pretty much interchangeable for that purpose, aren't they?
I have to disagree with you. I have to wrongly disagree with you.
Well, I actually was first.
That it's Mary Sue. Please go ahead, Anna. But I just want to say that.
Yeah. On your turn, sucker. All right. So I definitely understand what Allison's saying. Like, I know where you're coming from. There is that solid relationship between them. There's like fewer of them. They're very, very distinct, which is awesome. But I do also appreciate kind of the breadth of what TNG did, and it ran for many more seasons, I think, because of that, because it did involve little microcosms, and was almost like what Farscape tried to be, to have its like different peoples who lived in different areas, and Star Trek TNG succeeded at that a lot better. And sure, okay, right. Well, I mean, I feel like a lot of them did have their downsides a little bit. A lot of Mary Sue's, yes, but like, come on, like, we can imagine a group of like pretty awesome people, like, I don't know, us being awesome at things with, not necessarily being Mary Sue, because Riker wasn't the number one, so he kind of like lost some prestige and some things by being Picard's bitch, but that was also a very honorable thing that he was doing. He was serving a great man. And then Picard was always this snooty, like, snooty McSnooterson diplomat type. They, would be with his Earl Grey advising nonviolence, which also has his downside sometimes.
Up to, but not including the movies.
And of course, Worf. Indeed, you're right about that. Worf and Data, definitely two of the most diverse characters in the sense of, and not just diverse, but I guess one-dimensional in their reactions to things. And I mean, maybe that's kind of my point about the TNG, that it had slightly more complex characters instead of these boiled-down personality archetypes. So I can see benefits of both.
Okay, so, as I was saying before, I completely disagree with the notion that the characters in TNG were Mary Sue's based on the actual definition of what a Mary Sue is, which originate from Star Trek fan fiction. But I won't really go into that here, because then I'll be talking forever. The thing with the relationship in the original series was basically a balance that was centered on Kirk. He had his logic and he had his emotion, which was Spock and McCoy respectively. And that's why the three of them worked together very well, but if you took Kirk out of the equation, then Spock and Bones had a lot of trouble working together. They needed Kirk in order to complete that. The problem in the original series compared to later series after that fact is that because they focus primarily on this dynamic between the three of them, the other characters suffered as a result. And this was part of the reason why George Takei hates William Shatner, was because I don't know the exact thing right this second, but it was like they took away some of the things from Sulu to give it to Kirk. To really play on that dynamic. So we saw less of Sulu to really have a personality. He got to do a few things. Chekhov, the name we shouldn't name, Uhura. Scotty got a little bit more than the others, but not too much more. When we come to the next generation, we're trying to give a lot of characters a lot more personality. Now, because of its episodic nature, I think that's where a lot of people come in and say, oh, well, they're just Mary Sue's, because they had to solve the problem by the end of the episode, and they didn't have that many two-parters. But, you know, how the characters interact with each other and who they were individually, you know, there was the dynamic between Picard and Data. The Data went through most of Starfleet, and everyone just saw him as a piece of property, but Picard really tried to show him what it meant to be human, to teach him about humanity. Picard and Riker was just two military officers interacting with each other. Riker was a very jovial person. He could be serious when he needed to be, but, you know, he was, you know, a gambler. He was a ladies' man, you know. Worf definitely was a very unique character. He grew up as adopted, and he lived in Russia. He was outside of his element. He was always outside of his element, which most of the time he was closed off. You know, we have all of these characters that are very unique, but it takes a little bit more time to invest in them to see that uniqueness. Now, I agree with what you said about Picard being very stuffy and snooty and all of that, and there's actually a change in dynamic because of how the actor portrayed Picard, that he took what he did very, very seriously. And, you know, there was a meeting where he talked to all the other actors and said, you know, we got to take this very seriously, and they're telling him to lighten up, because if you look at later episodes, he was a lot more loose as a character and as an actor. So I really disagree with that notion. I agree, though, that there was more interaction between the main three versus what we saw in Next Generation. However, we were also splitting 7 characters in Next Generation versus the 3 in the original Star Trek.
I just wanted to, I mean, I think that those are all really well-made points. I think that when I think about how the Next Generation and the original show are different, I think that where I notice the biggest difference, which might be leaning to what Allison's point is, it's sort of like The Walking Dead. I'm just making that as a comparison. The Walking Dead is a show that on its surface appears to be about surviving the zombie apocalypse. But when you look closer, it's not about the zombies at all. It's about the people. And that the zombie apocalypse is just the backdrop. The original Star Trek show, and it might be because of the budget constraints and stuff, was more so about the crew members and, you know, their relationships to each other. Like that could have taken place on a Spanish galleon or on like a road trip across the country or whatever. Like the scenery could have changed from a starship to a boat or an aircraft carrier or a tank team or whatever. And it was really about the characters' relationships with each other. The Star Trek original show is also told in a very episodic format, like where, you know, whatever the problem was dealt with in that episode. So they didn't really do like long frame narratives, and, you know, in the original. But in the Next Generation, they wanted to expand everything, make it bigger, because you had Trekkies now. You had people that wanted to know the world. You had all the films that came out that were expanding on the politics and the cultures and the technology and all the science. So by the time Next Generation came around, it became more about, I mean, the characters were still there, but you had all of the world building, and the world building kind of, in some ways, it became as prominent in the storytelling as the characters. But the original Star Trek was almost exclusively about the characters, and everything else was just the backdrop that it fell on, you know, the science fiction arc. And I think I could be wrong, so I'm not putting words in Allison's mouth. This is what I think. But I think that's why because you were working with so much less, the focus on the relationships between the crew members, especially between Bones, Kirk, and Spock, and then occasionally you had bits with Uhura and Sulu and Chekhov, as much as you might hate him, and Scotty. So it became about that, and then with whatever aliens were on at the time, even Khan. If you look at Khan's first appearance on the series, it was more about the character. But when the Wrath of Khan comes around, which is my favorite Star Trek movie, it becomes more about the narrative. It's basically the Moby Dick story, but there's a character-driven narrative there. So
a streaming-driven narrative.
Yeah, extremely. And I mean, again, I don't want to put words in Allison's mouth, but that's how I think of it when I think about how they're different. And that doesn't necessarily mean that one is better than the other. I think that it really just depends on what you prefer. I like the original Star Trek show, and I like it specifically because of that that level of human interaction. And I like the Kirk character. He appeals to me. So.
Okay, can I speak to that before? Just because I know I'm interjecting, but I wanted to speak directly since my name was mentioned. I will go out, and I'll probably offend everybody by saying if they had had such a solid way of writing character in Next Generation, I think it would have been a phenomenal show. Plus the attention to the detail in the universe, and I really am not unconvinced about adding more. Like adding more anecdotes about a character's life doesn't really make them come alive. What made them come alive was that dynamic that that Spock, Bones, and Kirk had, that they needed each other, that where one was weak, the other was strong, where one had one perspective, the other had this perspective, and they got on each other's nerves, and they helped each other out, and they argued, and they contradicted, but there was always that sense that they were in it together. Yeah, it was like it's that I don't know how to describe it. It's just this really potent
camaraderie,
but also just this really potent sense of magnetism and both poles of the magnet. They were a tripod, yeah.
They would fall without all three.
Yeah, and it was, you got that sense that they really. And it was a really robust sense of their characters that I just do not see in Next Generation. I just don't see it, and I never really got into. Bearing in mind, I never really got very far into Next Generation. So, because to be quite honest, my favorite character, bar none, was Spock. Like I absolutely loved Spock throughout everything.
I could see that, Allison. I could see that. That's logical to me.
It is logical to you.
Highly logical.
I really liked Spock. I didn't understand why people thought, Kirk was the ladies' man, because obviously it was Spock. I'm sorry. That's just the way it is.
I feel away, but
the girls do like the pointed ears.
Yeah, okay, well, go ahead. I stepped on you, Mad Cat, and I apologize, but I did want to speak to what Brian was saying, and he did mention my name, so
let's not forget
three times.
Well, you did
Paul
scratch up the
is the
paint a
hottest.
little bit, but it's okay. I can buff it out. I actually agree with you, Allison. I disagree with most of what has been said about TNG, but I do agree with you about the main dynamic of the three. And the problem in TNG compared to that is they try to have a lot more characters to be their own individual self, but you had to split them across the show, and it wasn't episodic. Everything was contained within a single show, unlike DS9, which had a lot of story arcs to it, but still was technically episodic. One of the things that we do have to be aware of when we look at the original series, well, actually with any TV series, period, is that it's not always the creators of the show, it's not always the writers of the show. Oftentimes it comes to the TV studio, the execs. And it's interesting, but both Doctor Who and Star Trek both failed with their first pilot. Now, Doctor Who was first by a few years, but Star Trek completely failed in its pilot. But it was actually Lucille Ball who convinced the studio that she ran to give it a second chance, and it's because of Lucille Ball that we have the legacy that we have today. I remember that George Takei was on an episode of something a while ago, and he was asked, did he ever try to get like a homosexual story done on Star Trek? And he said, yeah, I tried to talk to Gene Roddenberry about it. And Gene was like, well, I want to do it, but the execs are just waiting to cancel us any moment now. I mean, there was always this constant threat that the show would be canceled because they were doing something that had never really been done before. Not necessarily a space adventure, but that there was a lesson to be learned in each episode, that there was what it was, what Star Trek was under threat because it never had been done before. And that did have an influence on many of the decisions at that time. So that's why I think it was a little bit more character-based, where we focused on this dynamic of these three characters, because, considering the 60s at the time, yeah, it was nice that we had a black woman on the bridge, but, the TV execs were like, well, I don't know how they were, but given the time frame, I'm sure they would have had a problem with that. Or even with an Asian American so soon after World War II, or even a Russian character whose name we will not speak because of people here. I mean, this was out of the Cold War, and that was the reason why they added him. Also, he looked like the monkeys. But I think that's one reason why we saw that. And within Next Generation, it was probably more of TV executives of saying, we think we should have a lot more characters that people can identify with. So, yeah, we can say, what was good and bad about these shows, but in the end, it's often people who have no earthly business to give advice on how these shows to be run that do have a final say a lot of the times.
Do you think it sort of centers on Picard in the same way the original series centers on those three people and their
initially
their
it
dynamic? Did. In a way, it does. In a way, the Next Gen centers not on more people, but on fewer. It's sort of mainly on Picard, and everyone else is sort of a different arm of his rule or whatever. Does that make sense?
Tentacles.
There were some centric episodes of individual characters where they kind of came into their own, but Picard was primarily the main character in most of the episodes.
All right, so I'm gonna get in here with my I don't know what to call it, Picardical.
Your rapey robe and your Picardical.
Yeah, I'm just gonna saunter in with my plaid rape robe. I'm gonna give everybody rape hugs.
Should I take off my clothes first?
No, that won't
no,
be
you have to.
necessary.
No. The rape robe has magical properties. I won't describe them at this moment because I did want to get back to Star Trek. Or actually, I wanted to commend Lucille Ball was the one who made Star Trek possible. Is that right, Mad Cat?
Yes, it is.
That's actually pretty. I didn't know that. That's pretty astounding. I thought that was the time when women were men's property. I mean, that would have been like the 1960s, right? That's just one decade after the 1950s. I mean, how was it possible for Lucille Ball to actually be the reason why a pop phenomenon as large as Star Trek exists when she was a woman and obviously a victim of the patriarchy? I mean, what guy let her out of her box and undid the ball gag and the
to even give her own company that she was the exec of? What is this blasphemy?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I according to feminism.
Say about that. Lucy, you got some splaining to do.
I actually really like that screwball, and it's interesting because in that time period there were actually more female characters you could do, that kind of screwball comedian that we can't do anymore because the woman always has to be wiser than the man. It can't be a
that is literally me though. I love the fuck out of Lucy, and that is literally me. There's always something. I'm always like, there's suds coming out of the dishwasher or spilling or breaking, and I'm like, oh my god, I am Lucy. What is this?
You should
I
put that on your
appreciated that.
shows.
Yeah, but it just strikes me that we can thank Lucille Ball for this, even though feminism tells us that she was completely helpless and could do nothing. So she really can't be thanked. It's her male handler who allowed her to do it. According to feminism, we can't thank Lucille Ball. We can thank the man who allowed her out of her gimp suit for a day to save Star Trek. So whoever that
I
man
cleaned
was,
her from
thank
the
you.
kitchen.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
believe,
I chained her from the stove. Chained
I
her from
believe
the
it was her
stove.
husband. I believe they both owned a studio together.
Right, but it was her that intervened to save Star Trek, right?
Yeah,
And,
she
and
argued
whoever
that they should be given a second chance to do a pilot, which at the time, only one other show had ever done that, which was Doctor Who.
and whoever made Gene Roddenberry as Sandwiches, which is probably
Yeah,
a woman as well.
yeah. Well, but I mean, the thing is that we're not looking. We're doing the feminism thing, Mike. That means we are not looking for how women had influence in society or power or could do anything in the past. We're looking at how everything can be reduced down to men and what men did. That's the feminist lens. So Lucille Ball was a victim. She wasn't actually capable of doing this. It was the man who undid her from the stove and allowed her one day of freedom from being a complete and utter slave property that women were in the 50s.
Feminists do not pass the Bechdel test.
Yeah, I don't know what, but really, okay. Let's not. This is a tangent. I apologize. I took you
And
down
don't get me
this.
started. Don't get me started on that poor African American woman whose culture got co-opted by that Kirk that one time. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying, and this is also very respectful of women to completely erase their agency from history and turn them into victims of men. That's totally and completely respectful. That's what we all should be doing right now.
Well, speaking of women back then, do you guys know the story of Martin Luther King and his connection to Star Trek?
No, but I do know another story that has a connection to Star Trek, and I want to run this by you, Mad Cat, to see if this is correct. Apparently, we all know that the original pilot to Star Trek had a female second command called number 1,
Yes,
right?
number one.
And apparently the female test audience that saw Star Trek was quite offended by the fact that she was commanding men. And I think it was Gene Roddenberry who mentioned this and thought that they would be appreciative of this women's liberation stuff, but apparently they weren't. I found that interesting. I don't know, was it true? Nightcat,
Yeah, it was true. There was a lot of problems that people had. A lot of women didn't like it, that she was in charge of other men, and
The
that
funny
is
thing
why
is,
they
she
switched.
later went on to marry Roddenberry.
Okay,
Yeah.
that would continue, right, Nightcat?
But yeah, would you like me to tell my story now? You're right about that, by the way. But would you like me to tell my story?
Sure, go ahead.
So, Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura, she actually wanted to leave the show. She didn't really like doing the show, and considering the time, that's kind of understandable. Not because she was a black woman, but it wasn't really taken that seriously in as a career back then. And she had met Martin Luther King, and they were talking about the show, and he was saying how much he liked her being on it, and actually convinced her to stay on the show because of the positive influence that she was having for minorities. Even to the point that there was a little girl who had seen Star Trek and ran into her to where her mother was, and it's like, mom, there's a black woman on TV and she's not a maid or a servant or anything. And that woman grew up to be Whoopi Goldberg.
Okay, I wanted to put one thing in. That's pretty incredible, but I wanted to add one thing to this. To the people who actually said that she was like some sort of space operator, and they sort of demeaned her role in Star Trek. There are scenes in which she is actually doing technical work on her console that's involving actually circuitry engineering. I mean, she was, as a communications officer, I believe she also had an engineering background. I think they played that up a bit more in the movies, but she was not just a space operator. She had the ability to build frickin' computers. She was more like a space nerd. You know, and I love how the people just malign the role because they haven't actually watched enough of it to realize how much technical expertise she actually had.
I want to respond to that before Sherry jumps on. I think Roddenberry was trying to sneak things in like that because it was downplayed with her character, but there are moments that you could almost miss it if you're not paying attention to it, where she is showing an aptitude for even fixing circuitry.
Yep. And well, she was putting it in on the sly that which was it? Was it the studio executives or the female test audience that was more pissed off about all of this? I don't know.
About number one or about your?
Well, I mean, if they were, let me put it this way: if the female test audience that they ran Star Trek past first was pissed off at number one, what do you think their opinion would be of a black woman showing technical and engineering expertise on a bridge of a starship? I mean, people want to.
They probably would have been pissed off with it, and that's why they had to sneak it in there.
People want to blame male studio executives, but they're still playing to the audience. And this is what's really funny. I'm just as a side to Gamergate. In Gamergate, feminists recognize that the consumer has so much control, but they do not recognize it in the female-dominated mediums in which women are the primary consumers, that they have the control. And in this case, even back then, I think TV was starting or had already become the domain of women. So these executives are trying to appeal to a female audience, and we just forget that and just omit it. And women at that time didn't like these portrayals of women, and there was a huge amount of whitewashed, that's appropriate, racism within like the suburban female white communities that would also have, been against Uhura and portraying her as a technician. But anyway, I throw it out to Brian because he's been waiting patiently. I apologize, Brian. I hijacked you.
Oh, no, it's okay. I was just going to say that, yeah, I mean, about the comment about Lucille Ball's starting the, making Star Trek possible, and how, it was and to your point about how television was more or less aimed at women, so that by its very nature gave women a lot of I would say they were a demographic that people were trying to get the favor of. So it is sort of like this just sort of applies to that point. And it's funny because I thought that women in the '60s didn't have any agency or any power. I watched Mad Men. They showed me that's how it is. I don't get it. Like, are you telling me that they lied about that? I wouldn't never have thought that about. Because Mad Men, it was telling me,
Yes, because Mad Men is an accurate historical document.
Yeah. I thought that was. I thought I was really watching a documentary.
Okay. I'm just going to interject. In 200 years, the feminist documentary about the 2000, the noughties, and whatever we are in now, the 15s, the 10s. We are essentially living in the time where women were forced into sexual slavery in dungeons in the basement, and they were only allowed to eat a piece of bread a day to keep their heroin chic. And that's the world that women live in today. This is what the feminists are going to be saying in 50 years. That the world that we live in today, women are property. And
Allison, we gave you permission to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
Someone in the chat.
It is owned.
It
is owned. I'm owned. But this is how it works.
Get back to the Savage Giants.
Well, they always paint the ultimate oppression of women like 50 years before or 60 years because the living memory is starting to fade of that time, and that's when it was ultimate oppression and women were owned as property, and it's going to be now in 50, 60 years now. Me and Anna, we are slaves. We don't even have title to anything. We can't own anything. We are owned by our respective partners. And yeah. Okay, sorry. Continue. I'll shut up now.
In 50 years' time, they'll have forgotten how sarcasm works. So they'll hear you saying that, and they'll think, oh, there, you see, she's admitting it.
Comedy isn't supposed to be fun. Like
People are not going to recognize the sarcasm there. Like, I'm talking over everybody.
If
Like,
feminism's
oh,
still here in 50 years, it
well,
will have
something else.
mutated into something and taken over the world, and it'll
be horrible.
So I
It'll
don't
be
mean to
like-
cut
it'll be
in, but I kind of
1984,
want to
you know.
hear what Anna had to say about MLK.
Were you done, Brian, or is that still more
no,
stuff?
well, no. This has become catastrophic.
As always.
Anna.
Thank you. Speaking, you were talking about dirty tangents. I have one about MLK. That did you guys know that unsigned letter, but most likely from Hoover, that MLK received from the FBI, threatening him to basically go kill himself, and was threatening to reveal all of these orgies he was having with all these people to his wife, etc., if he didn't shut up and sit down. So that's kind of fun. So MLK was a badass B. He had lots and lots of orgies, so the more you know. But apparently there's also a comment in the chat about my Trips vs. Men series, and I made the video, but since my Patreon's like a nation, it barely exists. There's like one backer for $1. But I started college, my last class now, so time is like non-existent at the moment between the podcasts and my work. There's like no time, but I am working steadily in the minutes I do have to edit the video, and it's more than halfway done, so all of that is coming together slowly. But there's definitely a second installment. It has been made, but the upload date is probably somewhere in March, towards the mid-end, if I were to be optimistic. So that's all I had, I think.
All right.
Yeah, it's hard to come back from that segue. But I guess it was necessary show business. Sorry, Brian. I jumped
No, it's okay.
Speaking of Star Trek orgies,
in. Oh my god. All right, let's go there.
I like that idea.
Well, you got to follow that up with something, Mad Cat.
no, I'm good there.
All right.
You just leave that dangling. That's a
You
lot
can't
to
leave us like
dangling.
that, you bastard!
It's like almost at least 8 inches of dangling there.
Come on, man. If you're dealing with Riker, you probably got at least 12.
Well, you know, Natasha had sex with Data, and I've always wondered if he came with accessories.
Well, he
Well,
was fully
actually, he was
functional,
programmed in 3 different protocols. Thank you very much. They
and
do
he is
address
fully
that.
functional.
But he is fully functional and programmed in 3 different styles. But that does bring up something I wanted to say real quick about Tasha Yar. Is that why they killed her off? Because she didn't sit well with the with the women as well?
Actually, Tasha Yar didn't like how her character was really portrayed, because there was that one episode where she kind of had to fight, and there was a little bit of racism in the first season, and she didn't really like how her character was just always this. She was basically Worf, in all honesty, a female Worf. She was always the aggressive one. She was always the one who wanted to do battle, and there really wasn't any real dynamic with her character, so she wanted off the show, and Gene Roddenberry allowed her to be off the show. But she still was interested in doing work with it, and that's why they brought her back as Tasha Yar's Romulan daughter.
Okay. All right, there was something I wanted to add to another point, but now I have forgotten it, and now the silence is deafening. Let me see if I can wheedle it
Must
out
have
of
been
there.
my 8-inch dangling thing.
Well, you got to admit, Mad Cat, Star Trek orgy is quite the thing to dangle into the talk and then just not follow up with anything. Just leave it flat.
Okay.
Well,
how
one time
about
my mother
T'Pol?
showed me a Star Trek porn, so it's like,
There's
hey,
T'Pol,
Mom,
Trip.
I didn't want to think of you and
Yeah.
sex at the same time.
There's totally an orgy. There's like T'Pol and Trip and that one other Vulcan guy when they go into their bonfire situation. T'Pol was so hot. Let's just admit all that. Can we say that and move on? But I can definitely see that being a Star Trek orgy.
That's science friction.
Oh yes,
Let me
now I
grab
remember.
on the
Thank
ears
you,
and
Brian.
pull.
Thank you, Brian. What Mad Cat caused to disappear, Brian caused to reappear. Yeah.
Way to go, Brian.
Thank
what
you.
I wanted to say was that science fiction has been, since the very beginning, like I read short stories by Alfred Bester, and all the older science fiction greats, and they explored the idea of liberation, like women's lib, in their science fiction stories way before it was popularized in media and TV or anywhere. If you read those stories, Alfred Bester, whose wife I believe is an architect, wrote in the 20s and 30s, and she was writing about, for example, one very strong female character who was black. This was in the 20s and 30s that he was writing these female characters who were sexually liberated, not always like slutty, but just in control of their sexuality, and also were drivers of the plot, had incredible abilities, and not in a Mary Sue way necessarily, but just really competent female characters that were very interesting. 20s and 30s science fiction writers were writing this. 20s and 30s. Science fiction has been the realm of these kinds of concepts of what we would call gender equality before it became a thing with mainstream feminism. I mean, you look at the old Flash Gordon comic books, and the guy who was writing that was exploring gender equality and having women in the army and all kinds of what a society would look like with women in the workplace, and not just lower class, but all women in the workplace and all that. This has been an enormous part of science fiction since the very beginning, since the beginning of science fiction. This idea of having these, dare I say, empowered female characters. And feminists are now coming 100 years after male science fiction writers were writing these stories with these strong female characters. And they're coming into this community and yapping about us being retrogressive and sexist. Ladies, we got there 100 fucking years before you. You are sucking our tailpipe exhaust, and you are also not progressive. You are not actually envisioning a positive new future with positive new gender roles. You are actually creating the most restrictive traditional gender roles of all of human history, in which you expunge female agency from every aspect of human society, turn women into victims and men into the responsible parties. That is you turning back the clock to a time that may have never actually existed, but certainly is horrible. Anyway, rant over. Whoever wants to take it, Brian, take it away.
Well, it's kind of like what dreams may come, you know? We can all imagine a shitty future together, or we can all imagine a beautiful future together, and because of feminists, we're imagining a shitty fucking future. Stop that, feminists. You're definitely bringing us back. Allison's absolutely right about that.
No boldly going with them.
Yeah, well, Brian, you guys, Brian.
I know. I was going to. I mean, that was a very, I agree on all points there with what you said. I'm a big fan of pulp science fiction stuff like Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, and I did see those themes were explored a long time ago. Someone in the chat mentioned the original Starship Troopers book. Even the film does that, where where they were going there. So this is not really new. It's that you've already basically made that point much better than I could. I would just be repeating what you said anyway. But I wanted to ask you guys a question about the way female characters in the Star Trek shows have been handled. We looked at the friendship, like the tripod, as it were. And I think that's something that I really admire. Like when you see like this brotherhood or camaraderie between male characters, and I think that part of the reason is because it's kind of rare to see that these days, and so like to see something like that. But I also I'm kind of curious. Anna mentioned that in the original show, female characters were explored as feminine, and they were feminine and they were attractive. But I never got the feeling that there was something exploitative going on there, and I guess so. I want to look at 3 or 4 characters from various Starship shows, and so we can also kind of compare them. So Uhura from the original show, I can't remember her name, but the empath from the Next
Deanna
Generation.
Troy.
Deanna Troy, that's right. 7 of 9, and Janeway. And how
I'd like
they...
to throw one more in there just to balance it out. Kira from DS9.
Okay. And for those of you who are like big Trekkies that know it, like we're looking at shows from how they started, how they sort of portrayed the characters in the beginning, to how, you know, over time they made. Not that these are sort of like I wouldn't consider them to be primary examples of this kind of development because they are individuals and they are not representative of the gender as a whole. But we could look at how maybe the writing may have been changed or gone, you know, because like. You look at Uhura and Janeway or 7 of 9, and like you know, like I don't know, just give me your thoughts. I'm gonna put it on the floor for whoever wants to comment on.
I'd like to start with that with Deanna Troy. One thing that always bothered me about her character growing up was she was basically eye candy. She was just basically a pair of tits walking around. And they always did like close-up of her tits and then panned out. And I thought that they actually improved the character as the series went on, where she was wearing her normal Star Trek uniform like everyone else a lot more often, but she was still walking around in a dress more often than not.
I was curious. I'm sorry. I don't mean to butt in. I apologize. What wasn't the reason that she had cleavage showing had something to do with what she was? Like, wasn't that sort of like a part of the character? At least that was what I was told.
Not really.
They have weddings naked, for fuck's sake, and she can read your feelings. She's pretty intimate as it is.
Yeah, that's true, but as far as what he's saying about, you know, part of her character, no, she wasn't really like, you know, a sexually open woman as much as, you know, she was just an empath. But that really had nothing to do with why she dressed the way she did, in my opinion. It was just like, hey, we want men to watch the show, so let's show some tits on there. But her character did evolve to where she was able to take on more of a command role, where she could be a bridge officer and not just there for the captain's sake. Where she could lead other people, which she did on a number of occasions. And the writing did change for that character to make her a little bit more balanced out.
Okay. It sort of got quiet, so does anybody else
I can keep going with another character, so...
Well...
yeah, well, I want to interject and say one thing that actually harkens back to something before, so I know that I'm pissing people off, and I apologize, but the same women who were pissed at the portrayal of Number 1 in the pilot of Star Trek, because she was portrayed as having agency, are the same women who are pissed at nerds now because they think we're misogynist because we recognize women's agency to any degree. So, and it's so funny because they blame nerds for the same attitudes that women had before that led to women's restricted roles in fiction. They are blaming nerds for that same attitude that they have now. And I just want to throw that out. I know it's completely confusing. Let's go back to talking about female Star Trek characters. I have successfully concept bombed you, Mad Cat. There you go.
No, it's fine.
Well, I want to bring it back to something that was said in chat by Tara Keck, that 7 of 9 was more eye candy. I mean, did you see what she wore? I mean, it was like a small layer of clothing before you could see her tits. I mean, I'm surprised her nipples weren't popping out. I mean, that was skin tight, and yeah, she was basically eye candy as well.
Are you talking about Troy or 7 of 9 now?
7 of 9.
So is it bad for women to be eye candy, or is it just because that's all they were?
Well, in defense of 7 of 9, it seems like she was one part eye candy and then one part a different type of character that hadn't been seen in Star Trek and exploring it. She was almost the equivalent of Data and Spock in many respects.
Okay.
Although she was actually closer to being human than either of them.
Right.
I want to comment on it. On that. I don't know for sure, but my thinking is, 7 of 9 was supposed to be part Borg, right?
She was part Borg, yes.
Right. Like, how much Borg do we know?
Well, technically she was human, but she was turned into a Borg. But she was made a Borg at very early in her life, like 12 years old.
Okay. Now,
She was still pretty much. She still had the implants throughout her body, but her outward appearance was still like 90% human.
All right. Okay. So I'm gonna give a benefit of the doubt to the writers in terms of their decision to include a partial Borg character on the show, because they probably thought, it was at getting to the point with a lot of Star Trek shows where they were like, well, let's have an alien on here, and so you had like Spock, that's sort of like where it started, and that was a good idea, and then when TNG came out, they were like, well, let's have a Klingon, and we'll just change his backstory a little bit, and let's also put, I think Deanna Troi was not entirely human either.
She was half human. She was Beta Z.
Yeah, Beta Z, that's right. And then they were trying to make more the characters that may have been changed in some way, like they were altered. Either they weren't human or something happened to them. Like Geordi was blind and he had like the visor, and Data was an android. And that was to create, most likely, in at least in the outset, more character interaction dynamics to see how things would play out, to sort of like try to capture that lightning in a bottle they did with Spock, Kirk, and McCoy in the original show. As more shows came out, they tried more things. I think that Deanna Troi was there, or not Deanna Troi, I'm sorry. 7 of 9 was them saying, oh, let's put a Borg on there. And then somebody said, well, you can't do a Borg because they're part of a collective. Let's make her part Borg, or like have Borg tendencies. And I think that's cool because they were trying to explore that aspect of it. Just like the hologram, just like, any other number of non-human characters that they wanted to try to play around with storytelling. And I'm not making value judgment on whether or not it was good or bad to make the character sexual, but I'm trying to, because the thing is, I don't think the Borg were intended to be sexual, like the Borg itself. But 7 and 9, it is. I mean, and that's not good or bad, but this is just an observation. So the question then becomes, if it's clear that the Borg are not sexual, but 7 and 9 is, at least in appearance, sexual, then what is the motivation for the producers to do that? And where does that come from? Because if you look at Uhura, she was attractive, she was feminine, but she wasn't overtly sexual. So what changed between then and now? And my guess would be, if I had to guess, my guess would be they were trying to get more people to watch the show, a broader audience. And so this was one of the methods to do that. So, that would be my...
They were games of throning them with the tits.
Well,
Yeah.
I want to correct you on one thing. You keep using the word sexual when you're actually meaning sexualized.
Well, sexualization happens in your
Someone
brain.
Sexualizes
Otherwise,
what you put on someone.
Right. Well, basically, she had...
No. This is important. Sexualization happens in your brain. That's why, otherwise, doctors who are performing breast surgeries would have boners. So, sexualization is something you do in your brain towards a character. So, if you are choosing to notice the sexuality and the primary or secondary, whatever sexual characteristics, that's on you. That's not on the character that's presenting them.
No, and I agree with you on that, but I do feel that the purpose of creating these sexualized characters was there was a concern that maybe men wouldn't be watching this show. But specifically with Voyager, even though a Borg crew member was planned right from the beginning, it seemed like to come in a desperate time to take Kes off the show, which a lot of people seem to hate, and she was more like a child anyways, and bring 7 of 9, who was this adult woman who was very sexually beautiful, as a way to try to boost ratings. Because Voyager did suffer ratings compared to all the other series.
So are you telling me that Star Trek's primary audience was women, and then they were were using tidbait to get more men into watching it? That does not sound realistic at all. And what about ignoring the attitude that some women might want to relate to women that are sexual and attractive and in skin-tight outfits? Maybe actually bringing more women into the show is what caused, and the feminism is what caused the outburst of these sexual characters, as there's lots of women who want to and do feel empowered by the sexuality.
I hope that women did feel empowered by the sexuality, and I think that would be great, except that, these executives don't really think on those lines. They think of, well, we know this has worked in the past, so let's do it again. It's not like, let's try to do something new and unique and different. So with a show like Star Trek...
Well, in the past, do you mean like in the first Star Trek? Because you were saying that's not what they were doing. Or you mean
not necessarily
in the past?
in the past of what Star Trek has done, but in the past of what television has done.
Oh, so the executives have changed from between the movies.
Right. I don't think it was the show's creators that were really behind this. As I said earlier, I do think that execs come in and it's like, oh, well, we're going to need a young blonde woman to play this who has big tits. And the creators are like, what does that have to do with anything? Oh, well, we want more people to watch it. And it's not a decision that's really made on what's good for the show, but more of what will give us more money. And that's how they've always looked at things. And that's why a lot of good TV shows that are out there end up getting canceled, because they end up making changes that these execs think should happen, and they end up doing it and makes the show worse.
Anyway, as per my order to speak, I was wanted to bring up back to Brian's point of the Borg. You were wondering, like, what's the point of having a Borg on? Aren't they like the enemy? And oh my God. But Locutus, he was so popular with people when... like Tumblr's full of Locutus, and he's like a thing whenever you bridge Picard and the Borg. Somehow it was like a lovable combination, interestingly why. So I totally can feel that's why they brought back the Borg, half human element, to of course continue the tradition of Vulcan to android to now this half machine kind of logic, character. But it's interesting that the people responded so strongly to the Borg element. Well, I mean, of course, they also responded strongly to the Vulcan element. So there's a lot of neat things, especially the mind meld. How cool is that? That totally reminds me of the Farscape, Zahn's like brain orgasm type thing. Pretty cool.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the Borg and being so cool and all of that. That originally the Ferengi was supposed to be the big, fearsome enemy of Next Generation, but most people thought they just looked way too silly to be taken seriously. And that's why they were, at first, very formidable and then kind of downplayed later as being what they are now. So they had to bring in an awesome enemy, so they introduced the Borg. I think by season 3. And a lot of people love the Borg. I agree with you on that. And it really kind of set the tone for the rest of the show. I mean, after you do that, it's like people are hooked. And then Voyager had to ruin it.
Well, I think with the Borg, there is like an aesthetic. They have an appeal that's like they're dark and they're so unlike us and all that. And I totally agree with what Anna's saying. I think that the Picard Borg character, that combination was super cool. Because again, it was like it was just really cool looking. But I think to speak to what Mad Cat was saying, and then what I was kind of asking about, it's not necessarily about what the audience wants out of like a show like Star Trek, but more going to like what producers and executives think the audience wants and where the disconnect happens, and how that relates to how producers or people who create content may have changed or have been influenced over the years of Star Trek's evolution. Going back to the original show, when you have a character like Uhura, who again, attractive African-American woman, but competent, intelligent, not as Allison called her, space secretary. I mean, she knew what she was doing, and she did, like, she was a valued member of the team as much as everyone else. She had a role to play just as they did. But as as time moved forward and we supposedly became more progressive, the themes of of how some of these characters were created, sort of like in some ways they were altered to suit audiences that may not quite have been compatible with what the show's target was, because the original Star Trek was it was just a show about science fiction stuff, and people, if you liked it, you watched it. If you didn't, then you didn't. And maybe it was because the budgets were smaller and the risk was lower, but people didn't worry that much about, once it got off the ground, people didn't worry as much about whether or not they were going to get millions of dollars from ratings. But as we move forward, then people tried more tricks and gimmicks, in not just Star Trek but other shows, to try to get people to tune in and watch. And to make the female characters more sexually appealing was, I think, one of the ways that they did that. Among other things, like bigger special effects, maybe some character deaths or whatever. And I was just looking at that evolution. I think that 7 of 9 is something that was done by design. Because I remember, I didn't watch that show because I was involved with other things, but I remember when the character sort of first came around and she had like the skin-tight outfit, it wasn't just the character on the show. There were posters, there were T-shirts, there was all this merchandise that you could get that featured the 7 of 9 character, the cardboard stand-ups and so on. Even if you move forward to now, to the remakes of the Star Trek films, one of the standout moments in the second Star Trek film, Into Darkness, was that one daughter of the admiral in like what appeared to be leather lingerie, who is just sort of like caught with her clothes off because she's changing in front of Kirk, and there is a lot of cheesecake, and I think that part of the reason is the new Star Trek films were specifically made to get a broader audience, and the producers and executives behind it that sort of put this together, and maybe the directors and writers, who knows, I don't pretend to know that. I think that was a conscious choice they were making, so they were like, well, look, we don't want to make Star Trek alienating by making it like overly too deep for people. We want to appeal to the lowest common denominator. So all of the themes that are lost on people from films like The Undiscovered Country or The Search for Spock or The Wrath of Khan, those things a lot of people don't get. Like they just sort of, they miss that. So instead we use explosions and music and action and even like strange science, like that weird red goop that creates black holes. In the new movies, because they make for more spectacle. So I think that this is, I mean, I could be wrong, and this is why I'm putting the question out there, but I think that this is where that is coming from, where you see these characters like 7 of 9 and Deanna Troi as opposed to Uhura. Not making a value judgment on either. I think that's fine, but I just wonder where it comes from.
Well, I want to hear what Anna has to say about this, but I do want to make one point real quick. In kind of defense to Into the Darkness, which I really didn't like that film. It had so many problems to it. But you are correct that it was trying to reach a new audience. And as far as Carol Marcus appearing in her underwear for a brief moment, I kind of excuse that because they're trying to suggest to people that Jim Kirk and Carol Marcus end up having a relationship, which in the original movies, it's strongly hinted that they had a relationship and then they stopped and had a son together. So they were just trying to do something real quick that didn't detract from the story of, oh, I wonder if those two people end up hooking up. So there's a little bit of, oh, well, we want to try to sexualize her real quick so people can get a hard-on from it, but it's also kind of points out, a little detail.
Nobody else has anything to say about that? It's so quiet.
Well, I've been talking a lot. I want to try to give other people a chance to speak. But as far as what you're talking about a cultural shift, because if you think about it, in the original Star Trek, all the women were in skirts. And I'm sorry, but on a military vessel, even a relaxed military vessel, I don't see women walking around in miniskirts. And that's just me. I mean, that just doesn't really seem like something to wear. I think wearing like pants and a shirt is what you wear. Because in our current military, except in dress uniforms where they can wear a skirt down to their knees, when they're in their fatigues, there are no skirt fatigues.
Well,
And that's a shame.
okay, but here's the thing: that wasn't a military vessel. Like that's a very crucial point with Star Trek is that these are not military vessels. They're supposed to be for like almost like a science vessel. So you can give them a pass on that. They don't necessarily have to be dressed like military because they're not military. But on the other hand, no, I actually think that is an acceptable thing because I think at that point, I mean, I don't know what to call the Federation or
Well, Starfleet is the military aspect of the Federation.
but it was pretty clear in the series that they were not military. That the Star Trek Enterprise was not a military vessel.
Depends on which Enterprise you're talking about. First Enterprise was more military. Second Enterprise was less military.
Yeah. I believe that Gene Roddenberry's vision was not of a militaristic future, that this was solely peaceful exploration with violence as a last resort.
Right. The original Enterprise was designed for a 5-year mission to go exploring.
Yeah, so I mean, in that sense, they're not. You don't have to hold them to military standard because they're not really a military force.
Even though they have military rank and insignia.
Well, yeah, that might just be for expedience sake because they do have a hierarchy. But I mean, you could make the argument with the movies because they are definitely going to more of a militaristic feel with the movies, and they also brought back the miniskirts. So I take your point with the movie version of Starfleet, but I think that the original series gets a pass simply because I don't think they were intended to be military. So
I can give you that, but I'm just saying that even back then they were still sexualizing females in the skirts. I do want to point out though that even though that the characters were sexualized, that doesn't mean that they didn't still have their own characters outside of that they were still well-written characters, most of them. I just think that there was a decision somewhere to make these specific changes to try to attract people to the audience and not necessarily what the creators wanted.
yeah, and somebody else pointed out in chat that there were military forces in history that did sort of wear skirt type things, like Romans and the Greeks. They had their leather mini
And the Scottish!
And the Scottish. And the Scottish, and then you also have the Woads, who basically were naked except for blue paint. But I guess you could do that too.
None of this seems like an efficient thing to wear in an environment that can go zero gravity at any moment.
Oh yeah, I guess that's a good point too. But that was never really explored. The idea of zero gravity. Nor was how they simulated their gravity really. And it actually becomes really crazy because it's like this top-down gravity that has absolutely no relation to the shape of the thing that they're in. So it's, I guess, wherever the gravity sink thing that was simulating the gravity must have been like at the bottom or something.
Yeah, it was.
How did that relate to but how did they make it so the gravity was uniform throughout the entire ship?
That is a Star Trek question that you have to ask a Trekker to give you a complicated explanation that just kind of ruins the experience for you.
A wizard
But
did it.
in all of Star Trek, I can
Wizard
only
did it.
think of one moment that that the gravity failed, and that was in Star Trek 6 on the Klingon ship. I don't remember any other time that gravity actually failed on the ship and people started floating.
I think that with the costume design of the original show, we also I try to think of it in the context of when it was designed. So I'm breaking the fourth wall here. It was the '60s, and we tend to be influenced by our current fashion. You know, like it influences us when we're living in that time. So I think that they were looking at things like uh, airline captains and stewardesses, and they were basing their designs on that. And they were also probably thinking we'll make them uniform in that we'll color code them, we'll give everyone badges, and we'll give them all stripes. But that's about as far as it'll go, because we need to establish this with a certain level of immediacy, and we don't want to bog it down with too much of the military, jargon that might go along with that, because you have to make this consumable for regular people. Also, with the science fiction thing, it hadn't been that long since we had landed on the moon, so I think there was still a lot of stuff that a lot of people just didn't know. I mean, unless you were like really into that at the time. And I don't doubt that Roddenberry had done his share of research, but I think that with all of the hands involved in getting the show made, there were probably more people than not that were just sort of like.
Didn't we
not
land
interested.
in the moon in 1969?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. It hadn't been that long, or we hadn't even done it
Star
yet.
Trek came out in
Star Trek, yeah.
1966.
Yes, but we were sort of like we were talking about the moon and outer space before that, so there was like already an interest, and I think that's why the Star Trek show got made.
I think there is some validity to your point, because at that time, no female had ever served aboard any sort of military vessel, whether a ship, submarine, aircraft carrier, what have you. So they probably did look at like what stewardess were wearing on airplanes to make the costume for the original Star Trek.
Which is, of course, another testament to the show, because they were like, why don't we put a woman on the ship? And why not make her black? Who cares, right? And I think that was great.
Well, it actually speaks to the progressiveness of science fiction as a genre, which is really like I just boggles the mind how feminists are pointing at nerds and geeks who've been the bastions of science fiction since forever and saying we are the retrogressive ones, when the same women with the same feminist sentiments that women are defined by being victims and lacking agency were the same women who were complaining about this woman being depicted as having agency. I mean, it's the same attitude then and now, and you are the ones saying that we are the retrogressive ones. It's just, it really chaps my ass. You might have noticed that.
Another great thing about the original show too, and I'm sure the later ones actually, I think they were all like this, all of them, and it's like a consistent thing across the board. The ships would have people of like humans or Earthlings, maybe you want to call it, of different genders and races. And it never really came up. Like, they were just on the ship together. Like, I don't remember.
Actually, it did come up.
How?
And I know, for example, in Next Generation, there was one episode where they found a guy who was injured, and he'd lost his memory, and he comes in and he's like, this ship is so amazing, so many different people, all working together.
Yeah, well, that's in a good way. That's good because
yeah.
I mean, but for the
Well,
most
it's part of the universe, the Star Trek universe. They past racism, past world hunger. They're like evolved in a certain way from our world. Part of that appeal, in fact, of Star Trek universe is that next level of where humanity envisioned itself to be.
And the irony is that character then turned himself into pure energy at the end of the episode.
Well, think about that Abraham Lincoln was in the original Star Trek episode, and how he reacted to I can't even speak anymore. Uhura.
that was another thing and they did this in the Next Generation. I can see that because we're in the 90s at this point. But in the original show in the 1960s, that they would do it, and they would do it with such a flair of, well, yes, we're going to do this, and so what? I think that's great. And you know, and then actually the fact that Lucille Ball was one of the, you know, the person who got it going. When you think about her show, and where you have a redhead woman, because you know how hard it was to be a ginger back then. But no, you have a woman who's married to a Cuban man, and they have like a biracial child together on there. I think that's, you know, that speaks volumes. But the way that they handle it was in such good taste, because they never made it a point in the original Star Trek to point out how progressive they were being as they were doing it. Like, they weren't patting themselves on the back; they were just making the show. And I think that's how a real, you know, progressive culture would be if they had moved beyond racism and sexism and all these other things. It wouldn't even be a topic of discussion. It would be as old as, you know, it'd be like debating witchcraft. Like, there'd be no point to discussing that anymore because we're so past it.
Well, let me put it this way. If the gender movement had been taken over by science fiction geeks, we would have had a black, lesbian, disabled president in 1951. But instead, the gender issue has always been controlled by a bunch of women blue-nosers who are obsessed with expunging female agency from human existence. They don't want to see it in number one, in the first pilot of Star Trek. They don't want to see it in women in history. They don't want to see it in women today. They always want to reduce women down to being incapable. And it's exactly the same attitude that female audience of the first Star Trek episode couldn't stand number one because she was portraying a woman with agency, and feminists cannot stand women with agency. We must all be reduced down to victims. So if you had left that up to us, the ones with the least social power, who envision egalitarian futures based on merit, if you had left it up to the science fiction nerds that you are now turning around and pointing your contemptuous fingers of anger and moral judgment that we are the ones who are chauvinists and bigoted. If you had left it up to us, ladies, we would have gotten much further than you.
Exactly. It's the same hyper-conservative, fundamentalist attitude that's, I guess, hyper-feminized, that actually seeks that ugh male and me woman. And it's just this extremely regressive basic instinct, primate attitude towards gender dynamics. It's way too polarized, as opposed to hyper-masculinism that actually pervades science in some ways, where they are so narrow-minded and keep testing like down to the tiniest microbe instead of bringing together unified theories. We all need to come back more towards the middle, as the nerds have, being more of having, I guess, feminine and masculine together, and of having this true gender blindness and entirely a merit-based attitude, and that is definitely way more progressive. But these religious nuts, and I don't mean just Christianity or organized religion, but conservatism, or the dogma of science, or any kind of attitude that they're married to, in the sense that is a religious thought to me.
I understand what you're saying. So
so it's religion versus intelligence battle. Damn it! They keep trying to drag us back.
It's the battle between something demanding that something be explained by this other thing, and just being open to what it could be explained by. But yeah, that's sort of a bit of, I think, a tangent. But what was I going to say? I was going to say, yeah, feminism is I would agree, it is sort of a religious fundamentalism in which you expunge female agency from all of society. You just refuse to see women as responsible for anything, and they just reduce them down to victims. And that's exactly the same attitude that caused number one to be removed from the pilot of Star Trek, because she was offensive, because she had agency. She was a woman with agency, and women didn't like that. And
eventually they reduced her to a computer.
Yeah.
And yet it was a woman with agency that ended up saving the show.
Yeah, I know. It's just, and oh gosh, there was something more I wanted to say. Something to take off of cherries, but I've just completely frickin' my brain is not working today. I apologize. I think
I'm
I've
sorry, Allison.
ranted
I
too
chased
much.
it away.
I think we all
No,
want to
no,
take
yeah,
things
no,
off
actually, it
Jerry.
is your fault. It's entirely your fault.
It's
Everything,
all me.
yeah,
It's
all
a
you.
Taking
patriarchy.
agency.
You're the spanner in the works there, Cherry. Um, yes. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, it is that sort of retrogressive desire to create this kind of binary. Um, I don't know where I'm going with this. Brian, save me for a second.
Okay.
Regressive people get so regressive that they need to convince themselves that they're progressive, and they do that by finding the most progressive people they can find and telling them they're regressive. I don't know how they work it in their head, but they do. And they go round and round and round for all of history, and it's been working so far.
I want you to stoop down to my level.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was quote. I was quoting Shoe on Head.
I love Shoe.
um,
Yeah. I think we've talked it out.
yeah, we have. The last thing I wanted to say was, shut up, Wesley.
Oh, you haven't
Worf,
mentioned
no.
Wesley. Oh God.
There is a video called Trekkie.mov where they show Worf firing on Wesley Crusher in a shuttle and it's destroyed.
That's funny.
They use special software to link a lot of episodes together to create that effect.
I thought he was cute. Shut up.
You know what? But he's
Talk
grown
to
up
him now.
to be not so cute.
No, yeah. Well,
Agreed.
he's still. You just want to smack him. Like I've watched episodes with Wesley in them, and I'm just like, I want to kill this man, this boy.
I would, but I fear that all of the skin on my palm would get torn off by his bristly ass face. So I don't think it's worth it. So he looks like he looks like the little kid that wanted to be a lumberjack and just never managed it.
How do you fail at being a lumberjack?
You just fail at beard. You fail at bearding. His beard just looks gross. He's a gross looking dude.
So what you're saying is he's a lumberjack, but he's not okay?
He is not okay.
He sleeps all day and he works all night. So
No, and he tweets all day.
Yeah, he tweets all day.
Oh my God!
Hey,
this
there's
is
nothing wrong
horrible.
with that.
We're beard shaming this Will Wheaton. We're
I'm gonna
beard
beard-
shaming him.
I'm gonna
Well,
beard
you know,
shame the crap out
Just
of him.
remember, Wesley, Will Wheaton says, "Don't be a dick." That's his job.
Yeah, that's his job.
I think
He
we
did.
could do a whole episode on bashing Wesley.
Oh yeah, it'd probably be one of the most popular episodes too. People love it when you bash.
In a recurring time warp mission, Wesley is subsequently beamed down into the blast plate of the Star Shuttle Columbia, and then beamed back aboard and used in Lieutenant Tashiyar's kitty litter box.
Notice how there are no reprehensible female characters. That's kind of interesting. Thanks, feminism.
Well, but no. There are no
Against
reference.
Roller.
Characters.
Guinan is a piece of I can't even just no. That is the most non-character magical trope. I can't even.
What
on
about
Guinan.
Janeway?
Janeway's very
I've
often
never
a
watched that
complete
crap.
cunt.
I don't
Very
watch
often.
Voyager. It's feminist rhetoric, and I choose not to expose myself to it unless absolutely.
tell you
necessary.
Don't you know what Guinan is?
Janeway.
Guinan is the fourth wall.
And Guinan is stupid and just no.
I'll tell
They
you
took
what-
away everything they took away all of Whoopi Goldberg and just left her like cut out, and it's pointless. It's the worst of both worlds. It's awful. I can't even.
Oh
on
yeah,
that.
I wasn't a fan of Whoopi Goldberg. I don't know. It just was so weird. I was like, "You're just jumping Flapjack Flash. What are you doing here? I can't."
I can't. No. It
I
was-
will tell you what's
bad
wrong with Janeway. She was a walking cliche. Every time they put a camera on her, she just gave a one-liner like, "Oh, it's time to turn fantasy into reality," and I'm like, no one would ever talk like this. She always just had to have the last word in any conversation.
Janeway needs to level up. She was like Katharine Hepburn. That's all I could think of when I saw her. She was just like Marsh,
Wait.
you know.
All right. Okay. Question for you, Brian. Why are you randomly screaming?
Oh, I was doing the Who thing from was it like a Law and Order show?
No, CSI.
CSI, yes, the CSI Miami thing.
The problem was you didn't have any shades to put on at the time.
No, well, I couldn't. So in CSI Miami, when they would have these really corny openings sequences, and David Caruso would put his shades on and he would make a comment, but it would be this really absurd, cliche, corny-ass statement, and then it would go right into the opening, and it would start off with this bit from The Who, which was, yeah! And then it was from the song, Never Get Fooled Again. And that when he mentioned the Janeway quote, I thought about that, and I hooed. I had to jump in and hoo. That's all. The internet knows.
Okay.
The internet knows.
The internet will.
Fair enough. It just seemed like this random screaming that you've been doing all show. What's going on with you, Brian? Is there something wrong?
Always.
Should we send aid?
Yeah, should we send aid?
Yes. Send.
Are you
Brian.
being hug raped?
Brian,
By any
one
chance?
blink for yes, 2 blinks for no.
Heels, please.
No heels for you.
Okay, I think we should call it because it's now completely in the weeds.
Yes, we're waffling.
Yeah, we're
I'm in the
we're
I like
flailing.
waffles. I like waffles.
We're flailing among the algae and
So
And waffles.
seaweed and
I
waffles.
like waffles. I
Wow,
like
that's
waffles.
quite the mess of shit that we're
I like
flailing
the
in.
waffles.
Waffles.
Okay.
All right, so Mad Cat
before we-
has something to shill, so
yes, you had Cat. You
Go
have
away.
something you want to show.
Yes, my turn to shill for once. All right, so I'm doing an event on Sunday around 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. It's going to be an event with Mercedes Carrera where people will be able to come on, give a special message to Cytheria, and then ask Mercedes a question live. So check out the hashtag #HopeForCytheria on Twitter, and I will be posting information on how you can be a part of that event.
all right, thanks, Mad Cat. Do you have any shills, Brian?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I drew a picture for Mike, and I'm happy. That's it.
Okay, so let's all
It's the little
take a
things.
moment. Take a moment to be happy with Brian for drawing a picture for Mike.
Yeah,
Yay,
I'm
doodles.
gonna be uploading a video tomorrow. It's gonna be pretty epic.
Okay, so I guess the shill here would be, if I sense a shill, go to Dr. Randomer's channel tomorrow, which would be March the 3rd,
Don't miss the epic.
and don't miss the epic. Yeah, okay, Cherry, you have a shill. Shill.
I have a shell. I don't have a shell. I have a thing for the fundraiser thing that we're gonna talk about later.
Okay,
But
yes.
other than that-
shh, shh, shh.
Shh, shh.
Oh wait, I
Okay,
forgot.
fine.
I'm gonna be on Skeptor and Goodfellas podcast on Friday as well. which could be
Okay,
pretty
all
cool.
right. Okay, so also Mike is going to be uploading something on Wednesday, the 3rd of March, and also going to be doing something on Friday, the 6th of March, with Goodfellows. All right,
And Skeptor.
and Skeptor.
Yeah.
Can't forget him.
And beware
who that
the
is, but
Ides
we
of
can-
March.
Exactly. All right, so everybody's done?
Yes.
Okay. Anybody gonna pop out of the woodwork in the last couple seconds?
No, I think we need
Surprise!
We should all say "Shut up, Wesley" in unison.
to shut up,
And
Wesley. Can we?
Okay.
Do we need to point people in the direction of anything else, like Patreons and shit like that, or no?
Do you want to give him a break, or I could do that? We have a patron. It's patreon.com/honeybadgerradio. It allows us to do this show, and listeners like you are the reason why we are able to do this. Well, listeners like you who don't just listen but also donate. That would be key. But not that I'm... Okay. Shut up, Wesley. I don't know where I'm going with this fucking shit. Shut
No,
up,
that
Wesley.
sounds good.
Also, special repeat guest coming on tomorrow's show because we're doing a Gamergate episode tomorrow, and that's cool.
Okay, no more shilling. Shush. That's why I asked like 3
I'm done.
times. Yes, quiet.
Sorry.
All right, show is over.
You guys are gonna tune in anyway. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
We love you.
Yeah.